I was 34 that summer, sweating my way through another dead-end season of construction jobs around southern Maine. I had just finished a 2-month drywall contract in Biddeford, and work dried up fast after that. I was staying with my cousin in Portland, sleeping on a beat-up couch that reeked of old beer and dog hair, and watching Craigslist like a hawk for anything that paid under the table. That's how I got the cabin job. It was a listing buried under general labor, posted by a guy named Arthur something. I don't remember the last name. He said he needed help finishing a remote hunting cabin in the woods near Sebec Lake. He'd provide tools, a generator, and supplies. The pay was $700 a week, cash. Said he'd already built most of the shell, just needed someone with basic framing and roofing skills to help get it weathertight by September. I didn't think twice. I replied. He messaged me the next day with a simple plan. I was to meet a man named Dave at a gas station just north of Dover Foxcroft. From there, Dave would lead me to the job site where I'd be staying alone for 2 weeks. It all sounded a little strange, but I was broke and desperate. I packed a duffel, threw in a raincoat, gloves, some work pants, and a good utility knife. I had no car, so I borrowed my cousin's old F-150 with a leaky muffler and left Portland early on a gray Tuesday morning. By the time I met Dave, it was late afternoon. He was waiting in a silver Tacoma at a pump near the woods line, and he barely acknowledged me. He handed me a map scribbled on with pen, told me to follow closely, and led me north on a dirt road that disappeared into deep forest. It was bumpy, overgrown, and silent. After about 20 minutes of driving, we stopped at a small clearing with a stack of lumber under a blue tarp and a single half-built cabin standing there like a skeleton. Dave waved once, turned, and drove off. I stood there in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by absolute stillness. No cell signal, no radio stations, just the woods pressing in tight around a simple, unfinished wooden box that was to be my home and job site for the next 2 weeks. The cabin was basic, just a 20 by 24 wooden frame, no siding yet, roof half done. Inside was a single cot, a plastic bin with food and bottled water, a propane heater, and a battered old generator. No electricity beyond what the generator gave. No running water, just buckets and a jug for washing. The work wasn't bad the first few days. I got into a rhythm. Wake up with the light, eat something cold from the bin, fire up the generator, and get back to nailing, sawing, lifting. The forest around me was beautiful but quiet, almost too quiet. No birds, no bugs. I thought that was odd, but I didn't dwell on it. The third night, things changed. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of metal scraping outside. At first, I thought it was the wind brushing tree limbs against the frame. I stayed in bed, listening. Then I heard it again, slow, deliberate, like someone dragging something heavy across the plywood porch. I stayed completely still. The cot creaked if I even shifted. I strained my ears, but after a few minutes, it went silent again. The next morning, I checked around the site. Nothing seemed out of place. Maybe an animal, I told myself, but the sound had felt too intentional. It didn't sit right with me. I tried to brush it off. I kept working. The days were hot, the nights cold. Every day felt longer, the silence pressing in like fog. By the 5th day, I started sleeping with my utility knife next to me on the cot. That Friday, I was up on the ladder finishing the soffits when I saw it. A figure in the trees. It was just a glimpse, gray shirt, dark pants, standing maybe 30 or 40 feet back in the woods. Watching, I froze. I stared at the spot. Nothing moved. I climbed down slowly, heart thumping. Walked toward the tree line, pretending to stretch, scanning the underbrush. No one there. I walked 20 feet into the woods. Nothing. Just trees, ferns, dead branches. No footprints. No path. No noise. I turned and walked back. All day I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I kept checking the trees. Nothing. That night, I kept the generator running longer, just to have the hum around me. I didn't sleep much. I left the cabin light on, knife in hand. The next morning, I found tracks. Someone or something had circled the cabin. Bare footprints, human-sized, but uneven. They went around the whole structure, stopping once at the back window before disappearing into the woods. I stared at them for a long time, stomach twisting. I hadn't walked back there barefoot. Nobody should be out here. The nearest road was miles away. I hadn't seen another soul since Dave dropped me off. I didn't have a gun, just the knife. I spent the day working with my back to the wall. I made fast progress, pushed myself harder. I didn't want to be out there another week. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I sat by the window, knife in my lap, ears tuned to every creak and crack in the woods. And then, around 1:30 a.m., I saw him, a man, standing in the trees. He wasn't trying to hide, just standing there half in shadow looking straight at the cabin. No light, no sound, just stillness. I stayed completely still too, crouched by the window, barely breathing. My mind ran through a dozen horrible scenarios. Meth head, escaped convict, some survivalist who thought I was on his land. I didn't know what to do. Eventually, after what felt like forever, he stepped back and disappeared into the dark. I didn't sleep a second that night. The next day, I packed everything. I nailed the remaining boards fast, finished the last section of the roof, and didn't stop for lunch. I wanted to be ready to leave as soon as Dave came back. But Dave didn't show up that day, or the next. I was out of fresh food by Sunday. I still had water, but not much else. The generator ran low on gas. I stopped using it to save what was left for emergencies. Nights were darker now, completely silent, no hum to comfort me. Monday morning, I found the footprints again. Closer this time, fresh. I made a decision. I wasn't waiting anymore. I folded my tools, jammed them in my duffel, and left the site around noon. I had the map Dave gave me, but I wasn't sure how accurate it was in reverse. I tried to follow the dirt road back the way we came. An hour passed, then another. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere because the road started to narrow and twist in directions I didn't recognize. Then it ended, just stopped in a mess of thick brush and stumps. No cell signal, no signs. I was lost. I sat down on a log and tried to breathe. I had enough water for maybe a day. No food, no radio, no compass. I thought about turning back, but something told me not to. I didn't want to go near the cabin again. Not with that man out there. I started walking through the woods, keeping the sun over my left shoulder. I figured if I walked long enough, I'd hit a logging road or something. By dusk, my legs were jelly. I was scratched up, sweating, exhausted. I found a low spot under some thick pines and decided to hunker down for the night. I kept the knife out, listened to the forest breathe. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps, crunching leaves, steady, close. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The steps got closer, then stopped maybe 20 feet away. I didn't look. I stayed still until dawn. When the sun came up, I ran. Not a smart jog, full-on panic run. I kept going west, guessing. My whole body ached. I tripped over roots, fell into a muddy stream, tore my shirt on a branch. By mid-afternoon, I hit a clearing and found an old rusted hunting blind. It looked abandoned, but there was a half-decent view from the top. I climbed it, looked around, and spotted a roof glinting in the distance. Civilization. It took me another 2 hours to reach it. A ranger station, empty but unlocked. Inside was a radio. I called for help. Someone answered. They picked me up an hour later. A warden named Sam. I broke down in his truck, told him everything. He didn't look surprised. said hikers go missing up here sometimes. Locals blame animals, but he'd heard stories, seen weird tracks, found burned out campsites. I never saw Dave again, never got paid. I filed a police report, but no one ever followed up. I moved back to Portland, picked up a warehouse job, and tried to forget it all. But sometimes, in the early hours of the morning, I wake up and swear I hear that scraping sound outside my window, like someone dragging something heavy across wood. I always get up and check. I always keep my knife close, and I never go near the woods alone again. My name is Daniel Graves. I was 37 the last time I used my father's old hunting cabin, a place tucked away deep in the Superior National Forest in northern Minnesota. It had been almost a decade since I'd last set foot there, and the place had been passed down to me after he died from a heart attack back in 2014. I didn't go up right away. Life got in the way. Work, marriage, and then divorce, one thing after another. But in the fall of 2022, I found myself needing to get away from it all, and the thought of that remote cabin came back into my head. A place where no one could bother me. No cell service, no noise, no distractions. Just nature and silence. It was early November when I made the trip. The colors had already dropped from the trees, leaving the birches and pines standing gray and green against a pale sky. I drove up from my place in Duluth with my old Ford truck, filled with gear, food, propane, bedding, 2 rifles, a Glock, and enough supplies for at least a week. I remembered the way well enough to not need GPS. You can't get a signal out there anyway. County Road 37, then an old logging road that narrowed the deeper it got. Finally, after 40 minutes of slow driving on that winding dirt path, the cabin came into view. It was smaller than I remembered. A simple log structure built by my grandfather in the late 60s. No electricity, just a couple of old gas lanterns and a rusting stove that used propane. No running water either. A hand pump well stood about 20 feet off to the side of the porch, just beside the remains of an ancient woodpile that had collapsed inward like a rotted rib cage. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. I unlocked the front with a key that still hung from the rearview mirror of my truck. Inside, the place smelled of dust and old pine, but it was dry and solid. The single room had a cot against the wall, a shelf with a few cans of beans and expired soup, a table with a rickety chair, and the old stove near the corner. A steel chimney ran up through the roof. There was a single window looking out over the slope behind the cabin where we used to drag deer down. I unloaded everything and settled in. That first night, I lit the gas lantern and warmed a can of chili on the stove. I sat at the table, listening to the wind push through the trees outside, that high whispering sound that only comes in the forest. The temperature dropped quickly after dark, but the cabin stayed warm enough. I slept light, half listening for coyotes or bears or whatever else was out there. But the woods were quiet. The first 2 days went well. I scouted the area, moved quietly through the brush in my camouflage, and found plenty of sign. Droppings, rubs, trails cut into the undergrowth. I even saw a young buck about 100 yards away, but I let him go. Too small. I figured I had time. It was on the 3rd day that I started noticing odd things, little details that didn't sit right with me. I remember walking along the ridge about half a mile from the cabin when I found a trail I didn't recognize. A narrow footpath not made by animals but by people. But the weird thing was how fresh it looked. The leaves had been brushed aside recently, and I could see boot prints in the soft earth beneath them. Big ones. Someone had walked through there not long before I did. I stood still for a long time, listening. The forest around me was dead quiet, not even birds. I didn't hear anything else, but that moment stuck with me. I figured maybe it was a hunter. The land wasn't technically private, just state land where our cabin sat on a long-term lease. So other people had the right to be out there, but it still bothered me. I hadn't seen another vehicle or heard a gunshot since I got there. I followed the path a short way, but it disappeared into thick underbrush, too tangled to keep going. I turned back and hiked to the cabin before the sun dropped too low. That night, I kept the Glock beside me on the table. I left the lantern on low while I tried to sleep, but I barely got a few hours. I kept thinking about those boot prints. The next morning, I woke up early and went out to fetch water. The air was biting cold, and frost had crept up the corners of the window. When I stepped outside, I stopped dead in my tracks. There were more footprints in the dirt by the cabin. I walked over slowly, my breath puffing out in little clouds. The prints weren't mine. They were bigger, deeper, and came from behind the cabin, out of the woods. They circled around to the porch and back again, like someone had walked right up to the cabin during the night. I crouched and looked closely. They were fresh, probably from the last 8 to 10 hours. I didn't see any sign of forced entry. The door was locked, my gear untouched, but the idea of someone walking around out there while I slept made my stomach turn. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat there with the gun in my lap for a long time. I told myself it was just another hunter. Maybe they saw the cabin and checked it out, figured someone was already using it, and left. But then it happened again the next night. Same footprints, same size, same path around the cabin. Only this time, I found something else. On the porch rail, there were scratch marks, 3 long gouges carved into the wood, right where someone's hand would rest. I ran my fingers over them and felt fresh splinters. This wasn't just someone passing by. They were watching me. I decided to leave the next morning. I packed everything I could, but I had a nagging sense of being watched the whole time. I kept looking out the window. The trees stood still. No sound, no wind, just that terrible silence. But when I went to start the truck, it didn't turn over. I tried again. Just a click. I popped the hood and checked the battery cables. They were loose, but not just loose, unscrewed, completely undone, like someone had been under the hood while I slept. My stomach dropped. I hadn't touched the engine since I arrived. That meant whoever was out there had walked right up to the truck and disabled it. I tightened the clamps and got it started, but by then I was rattled, shaking. I drove back to the cabin and locked myself in, thinking maybe I'd leave at first light. The thought of driving those narrow roads in the dark didn't sit right with me. That night was the worst. I didn't light the lantern. I didn't want to be seen. I sat in the dark with my gun on my lap, listening. I didn't sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind made my heart pound. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. Footsteps, not animals, not deer, human, slow and deliberate, crunching through the leaves just outside. I held my breath, then silence, then another footstep, closer. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then came the sound of wood flexing. The porch. Someone was on it. I gripped the gun, heart thudding in my throat. A long pause. Then a soft scraping sound near the window, like a finger or a knife against the glass. I didn't move. I waited for hours. Eventually, the steps moved away, slowly.
No rush.
The first light, I looked outside. Nothing. No one. But they'd been there, watching. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I just got in the truck, gripped the wheel, and drove out. Fast. I didn't stop until I hit the paved highway. I didn't even look in the rear view. I never went back. That winter, I contacted the DNR and told them I was giving up the lease. I listed the cabin for removal. Someone else could take the risk. Months later, I got a call from a county deputy up in St. Louis County. They'd found something while surveying the area, a campsite about 2 miles from the cabin, hidden off a ravine. It had tarps, old cans, and piles of stripped clothing, boots, and bones. Not animal bones, human. They thought it was someone who'd been living out there for years, maybe off-grid, possibly dangerous. They never found the person. I changed my number, moved out of state. I still think about that last night. Those footsteps, the scratches, the disabled truck. Someone had been watching me, hunting me. If I had stayed another night, I don't think I'd be alive. That cabin gave me silence, all right? But not the kind I needed. The kind you only find right before something terrible happens. And I still wonder if they're out there now, waiting for someone else to show up. It was October 2008 when I took a break from everything. I had just turned 33, and I was tired mentally, physically, the whole thing. I worked in a metal fabrication shop in Liverpool, and between the long shifts, the constant noise, and the oily stink that clung to everything, I just needed space. No city, no people, no damn phone ringing all the time. I wanted trees, mud, cold air, and nothing else. A friend of mine, Paul, had gone on this hiking trip up north around Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland the year before. He told me there were vast forest areas, lots of unmarked trails, and barely any reception. Just what I was after. So I planned a week off, packed a rucksack with the basics, tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, a bit of food, and drove up in my old Ford estate. I left the car near a logging road outside a small village called Kirkdale. From there, I just walked west into the trees, following animal paths and forgotten trails. By the third day, I was deep in the forest. No phone signal, no houses, not even fences. The sky had that early autumn look, cloudy but not heavy. The ground was soaked with old rain, the kind of wet that never fully dries. I'd been camping each night in a small tent, nothing fancy, just enough to keep the wind out. I moved slowly, stopped often, boiled water for tea over a little gas stove, and didn't think much about the world back home. On the fourth day, I found the cabin. It was maybe mid-afternoon, and the clouds were getting darker. I'd crossed a shallow stream and walked another half-mile through tall birch and pine when I saw something man-made between the trees. It didn't feel right. Not dangerous, just out of place. The cabin sat in a small clearing that looked natural but wrong somehow. Like the trees around it had been cut long ago and never regrew properly. The place was old, maybe 100 years or more. The wood was faded to a soft gray. Moss covered the lower walls. A small porch with a sagging roof sat at the front. No lights, no sound. The door was slightly open. I stood still for a minute, just watching. Nothing moved. No smoke from a chimney. No signs of life. I walked up slowly, boots crunching on damp leaves. The cabin didn't look lived in. The windows were coated in grime, and I could barely see inside. I knocked on the door out of habit, even though I knew no one would answer. Then I pushed it open. The inside smelled like old wood and damp clothes. The main room was simple. One old iron bed frame, a table, a broken chair, and a fireplace full of ash. A few empty tins lay in the corner, rusted and smashed. Someone had stayed here once, maybe decades ago, but it had been empty for a long time. I should have left. That's what I keep thinking now. I should have just looked around, taken a few photos, and gone back into the forest. But I didn't. The sky was turning dark fast, and it felt like rain was coming. I told myself I'd just spend the night there instead of messing around with my tent again. I cleared a space on the floor and rolled out my sleeping mat and bag. I boiled some water and made instant noodles while the rain started tapping the tin roof. Felt cozy in a way, safe even. I ate in silence, then sat with a headlamp on, reading a beat-up paperback. By 10, I was inside the sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep to the sound of rain. That's when I heard the noise. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a faint scraping, like something brushing against the outside wall. I thought it was a branch, Then it happened again, a bit louder. I turned off the headlamp and lay still, eyes wide open. I could hear the rain on the roof, but underneath that, there was movement. Something light, like fingers sliding across wood. I sat up and listened. The sound moved around the side of the cabin. Not fast, not heavy, just slow dragging. I waited, holding my breath. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. A creak, a shuffle, a step on wet leaves. But when I finally drifted off, nothing else happened. In the morning, everything was still. The rain had stopped. The air was thick with mist, but there was no one around. I stepped outside and looked around the cabin. No tracks, no signs of anything. I told myself it had to be an animal. A fox maybe, or a deer brushing against the wall. I stayed another night. That second night, it got worse. I made a small fire in the old fireplace using sticks I collected nearby. Smoked a bit, but it worked. I made tea and sat on the floor in silence. As the sun set, the air inside the cabin felt heavier. I kept looking at the windows, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing ever showed, but the feeling didn't go away. Started again just after midnight. The tapping this time, not scraping, tapping, light and slow. I froze. It was coming from the window to my left. 3 taps, then silence, then again. Tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I sat there in my sleeping bag, eyes locked on the window. My headlamp was off. I was in the dark. The tapping moved. Another window, then the back of the cabin. I stayed still for an hour, maybe longer. Eventually, the sounds stopped. In the morning, I checked again. Still nothing. But I found something odd behind the cabin. A small pile of bones. Animal bones, picked clean. They looked old, but why were they arranged in a neat little pile? That was the moment I decided I'd leave. I packed up everything quickly and took the same path back toward the stream. I was maybe 15 minutes into the walk when I saw something that made my stomach twist. Boot prints. Not mine. Bigger, deeper. They weren't there when I came in. They followed my trail from the cabin and kept going in the direction I had just come from. Someone had been behind me. I moved faster. I stopped less. I didn't eat. By late afternoon, I had made it back to where I'd parked the car. I threw my pack in the back and drove until I hit the next town with signal. I stayed in a small inn that night. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not the lady at the desk. Not the old guy drinking coffee in the lobby. No one. I showered and slept in a real bed, locked the door and pushed a chair against it. The next morning, I drove home. I didn't go hiking again for years. A few months later, I was on the internet, reading through some old local history forums. I was trying to forget about the cabin, honestly, but curiosity got the better of me. I searched for abandoned buildings in Dumfries and Galloway. I found a post from 2004. A guy had gone camping around the same area. He mentioned finding a cabin that looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. Same description, same clearing. He spent one night there and left because he thought someone was watching him. Then a reply under that. Different user. Said his brother had gone hiking there in 1996 and never came back. His last phone call had been from a payphone in Kirkdale. They found his car, abandoned on a logging road. No trace of him. I stopped reading after that. I never told anyone the full story. Not Paul. Not my brother. Not even my wife years later. I sometimes still wonder about the cabin, about the sounds, the tapping, the prints. Someone was out there, not a ghost, not a monster, just someone. And they're probably still out there watching the trees, waiting for the next person to decide they don't want to sleep in a tent that night. I got lucky. I didn't knock twice, and I never went back. I wasn't supposed to be there that weekend. That much I knew for sure. But something about the silence, the cold wind cutting through the trees, and the long, empty dirt road up Black Pine Ridge had pulled me in. My name is Marcus. I was 28 at the time, and what started as a simple weekend getaway turned into something I won't ever forget. Not because of ghosts or myths, there were none, but because of what people are really capable of when they think no one is watching. The cabin stood alone, far from any town or road with paved asphalt. It was my uncle's place, a small wooden shack built back in the 70s. I had never been here before. He left it to me when he passed away a few months earlier. The will said I could use it whenever I wanted, but warned me that the area was not for the faint of heart. At first, I thought that was just an old man's way of saying it was rugged and remote. I didn't know then that it was a warning about something much more serious. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The sky was a soft gray, the sun dipping behind thick pine trees that rose like dark sentinels. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles. I parked my rusty Jeep at the end of the dirt driveway, the wheels crunching over scattered rocks and fallen branches. I looked up at the cabin, a two-story structure with peeling brown paint, windows covered in grime, and a sagging porch. It seemed fragile, but it was sturdy enough to last decades. I felt a chill, but I told myself it was just the cold Vermont spring. The first night was quiet in a way that felt heavy. I unpacked my bag slowly. Inside, I had a small gas stove, some canned food, a couple of flashlights, and a basic first aid kit. The cabin had no electricity or running water, just a well outside and a wood stove inside for heat. I started a fire in the stove, watching the flames crackle and cast shadows on the wooden walls. I had brought a notebook, thinking I might write or draw, but after a few minutes, the silence pressed down too hard. I kept hearing things, branches snapping outside, a distant howl that could have been a coyote, or maybe just the wind twisting through the trees. I told myself it was nothing. I was alone after all. Nobody else was around for miles. I should have felt free, but the isolation felt like a weight. The next morning, Saturday, the cold was sharper. I woke early, shivering in my sleeping bag. Outside, the sun was barely touching the tops of the trees, casting long blue shadows on the forest floor. I brewed coffee on the gas stove and stepped outside to clear my head. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, trees so close together they blocked the sky. The ground was thick with needles and damp leaves. I could see animal tracks, deer, raccoons, something bigger, but it was too faint to tell. The air smelled like moss and rain. There was a small path leading down the ridge, probably made by hunters or hikers, but it was overgrown. I wanted to explore but felt a strange reluctance to go too far. As the day went on, I set about fixing the cabin a bit. The roof leaked in places, and the door creaked when I opened it. I found an old toolbox with a hammer, some nails, and a few rusty screws. I worked slowly, thinking about how my uncle must have spent years keeping this place together. Every noise, the thud of the hammer, the scrape of wood, echoed in the quiet forest. Late afternoon, I decided to walk down the path a little. I took my backpack with water and a pocket knife, just in case. The woods were dense. Birds called somewhere high above, and a breeze stirred the branches. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew taller and older, their trunks wide and twisted with age. The smell of pine was stronger here, mixed with something else, something earthy and sharp. I didn't see any people. No signs of recent visitors except a few broken branches and a torn piece of cloth caught on a bush. It looked like it had been ripped off recently, maybe a jacket or a shirt. That small clue sent a ripple of unease through me, but I shrugged it off. Maybe an animal or a careless hunter. On my way back, the sky was turning orange and pink. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye, something large, fast, moving between the trees. I stopped, holding my breath. The figure disappeared quickly behind a cluster of pines. It was too big to be a deer. I wasn't sure what it was. I didn't have a gun, just the knife and a heavy flashlight. My heart beat faster. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and double-checked the wood stove. The night was settling in deep. The darkness pressed close to the windows like a living thing. I sat by the fire, trying to keep calm. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, not like an animal. They circled the cabin. My first thought was to grab my flashlight and look out, but I stayed quiet, not wanting to reveal I was there. The footsteps paused near the porch, then moved away. After a few minutes, they stopped altogether. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump. The wind rattling branches, the rustle of small animals, the creak of the cabin settling. At one point, I thought I heard whispering, but I convinced myself it was just the wind or my imagination. Sunday morning came cold and gray again. I decided I wouldn't stay the second night. Something wasn't right. I packed quickly, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. Before I left, I took one last look around the cabin. That's when I noticed the back door was open, wide enough that I was sure I had closed it. The lock was broken, the latch hanging loose. I hadn't heard anything during the night, but someone had been there. Someone had been inside. I checked the small kitchen and living room. Nothing was stolen, but there were signs someone had moved through. Footprints in the dirt outside the back door, disturbed dust on the floor. It was clear I wasn't alone here. I hurried to my Jeep, the forest feeling darker and colder than before. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. When I finally reached the main road and cell signal returned, I called the sheriff's office. They promised to send someone out to check the cabin. I stayed the night in a motel in town, uneasy and restless. The next day, the deputies came with search dogs and checked the cabin and surrounding woods. They found footprints too big for any animal and some old campfires not on any map. The dogs picked up a faint scent trail leading deeper into the woods, but it ended abruptly. The deputies said the area was known for illegal hunters and sometimes squatters who used abandoned places to hide from the law. They told me to be careful if I came back. I never did. The cabin on Black Pine Ridge sits there still, quiet and empty, but it's not alone. Whoever was out there, whoever came inside that night, could still be hiding in those woods, waiting. The thought chills me even now. I learned that some places are lonely not because they're empty, but because the people who come there don't want to be found. That weekend taught me to respect that silence, and to never go alone into the woods without telling someone where I was going. I never thought much about graveyards before that summer. I was just a kid from a small town, used to quiet streets and the hum of everyday life. My name's Ethan, and this happened in the summer of 1998, when I was 23 years old. I had recently moved out of my parents' house to get some space, to figure things out on my own. I found a little cabin for rent about 15 miles outside of a tiny town called Millfield in West Virginia. The cabin wasn't much: old wood, peeling paint, a creaky porch, but it had a lot of charm, and it sat right next to an old, forgotten graveyard. At the time, I didn't think much about the graveyard. I was just glad to have a quiet place. The graveyard itself was small, maybe 50 graves, spread out over a few acres behind the cabin. I had seen it from the window the first time I arrived. Weathered headstones, some leaning over, moss covering the names. It was eerie, sure, but nothing more than that. Just old stones. The locals barely spoke about it, except to say the place was resting ground for early settlers. The gravestones had dates going back to the 1800s. The cabin was basic. One bedroom, a small kitchen, and a wood stove in the corner of the living room. There was no electricity, no running water, just a well outside and a battery-powered lantern. I didn't mind. I liked being away from the city buzz. For a while, things were calm. I spent my days reading, writing little notes, chopping wood, and fishing in the nearby creek. But after about a week, something started to feel off. The first sign was the quiet. The graveyard was oddly silent during the day. No birds, no insects, nothing. When I stepped outside into the sunlit morning, it was like the trees themselves held their breath. At first, I thought it was just how isolated the place was, but the silence was too deep, too unnatural. One afternoon, I went out to collect water from the well. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the graveyard. As I passed by the headstones, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Fresh footprints in the dirt, right near an old, cracked tombstone. The prints were large, heavy, like boots, and they looked recent, as if someone had been there just hours ago. I was the only one living near the cabin. Who else could it be? I followed the prints toward the edge of the graveyard where the forest began. They stopped suddenly at a thick patch of bushes. There was no trail beyond. It was like whoever made them disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, staring into the dark underbrush. I decided not to tell anyone in town. No sense in stirring up old stories or inviting trouble. Besides, who would believe me? I had moved here for peace, not to get caught up in local rumors. Over the next few days, strange things kept happening. At night, I heard sounds outside. Heavy footsteps crunching through the dead leaves, distant thuds, and sometimes a low humming, like someone whistling a tune I couldn't place. I kept the door locked and the windows shut tight, but the noises always seemed to circle the cabin. One night, around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something dragging across the porch. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the door. The beam of light caught the edge of a long wooden plank leaning against the side of the cabin. It had been moved slightly, as if someone had leaned on it or dragged it. My pulse was racing. I stepped outside, but the night was still. No sign of anyone. The footprints in the dirt near the graveyard had returned, dozens of them this time, leading up to the cabin and then vanishing into the woods. I started to sleep with a kitchen knife beside my bed, just in case. I told myself it was probably some local kids playing pranks, but the thought didn't settle well in my mind. One afternoon, I found an old book buried under a pile of leaves near the graveyard fence. The cover was tattered, pages yellowed with age. It looked like a journal or a ledger from the late 1800s. I brought it back to the cabin and spent hours reading. It was the diary of a man named Jacob Milligan, who had lived in Millfield in the 1870s. He wrote about the hardships of the town, the illnesses that took many lives, and strange deaths that no one could explain. One passage caught my attention. Asterisk. There are those who come to the graveyard at night. They say it's for the dead, but the living tread here for darker reasons. If you hear the footsteps and see no one, do not follow. They do not want to be found. Asterisk. I shivered, closing the book. I was beginning to understand the unease that hung over the place. The following nights grew worse. The noises turned into shouting. I couldn't make out the words, just angry voices, rough and harsh. Sometimes, I saw flickering lights deep in the graveyard, like torches moving between the headstones. I never saw anyone clearly, only shadows and movement. One night, I stayed up watching from the window. Around midnight, I saw a group of figures moving quietly through the graveyard. They wore dark clothes and covered their faces with scarves. They stopped by one of the oldest graves, a woman's grave, judging by the shape of the headstone, and began digging. My heart hammered. I grabbed my flashlight and ran outside. The cold night air hit my face as I moved toward them, yelling for them to stop. But the figures scattered instantly, vanishing into the woods. The grave had been disturbed. The freshly dug hole was deep and wide. Whoever had been there had been digging for something. I called the sheriff the next morning, but when he came to check, the hole was filled back in, the dirt packed down as if nothing had happened. He didn't believe me when I told him about the group of people. Said maybe I was imagining things, or it was animals, but I knew what I saw. I stayed on edge for days after that. I kept my phone close, my door locked, and avoided going near the graveyard at night. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a trap. One afternoon, I decided to investigate the grave that had been disturbed. I approached cautiously, feeling like I was being watched. The ground was soft but firm. I dug a little at the edge of the hole with a stick, careful not to disturb anything deeply. Suddenly, I hit something hard. A wooden box, old and rotting but intact. I pulled it out, wiped off the dirt, and opened it slowly. Inside were several old papers, a rusted pocket watch, and a few small items that looked like jewelry. The papers were letters written by the woman buried there, a Mary Langley. The letters spoke of secret meetings, warnings about people in town who wanted to take her land, threats against her family. It sounded like a fight for survival in a place where law didn't reach. I realized the group I saw was likely a band of people from the town, still protecting old secrets. Maybe they wanted to keep Mary's story buried forever. That night, I packed my things. I couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. I didn't want to become part of some hidden feud or old vendetta. Before I left, I took the box with me and gave the letters to a local historian I trusted. She promised to look into it and tell Mary's story properly. Driving away from the cabin, I looked back one last time. The graveyard lay still under the moonlight, silent again. But I knew that silence hid many secrets, some better left alone. I never went back. I moved into town and kept to myself, thankful for the peace. The cabin was rented out after I left, but the graveyard's shadow lingered in my mind. The story wasn't about ghosts or spirits. It was about people, their fears, their secrets, and the lengths they'd go to protect what mattered. Sometimes the scariest things aren't what you see, but what you know might be watching, waiting, and never quite gone. I was 34 the year I started building the cabin. I'd saved up for a while, worked construction in western Pennsylvania, mostly concrete and framing jobs, and by the fall of 2016 I had enough to buy a small piece of land just north of Ridgeway, maybe 20 minutes outside town, right near the edge of the Allegheny National Forest. The idea wasn't anything grand. I didn't want a vacation home or a fancy log getaway. I just wanted a place I could build myself, one room, something I could use for hunting or when I needed to get away. I was tired of leases, tired of landlords, tired of the noise. Out there, the closest neighbor was a mile off, and the land had a thick line of trees on every side.
No trails, no paths.
Just the gravel access road I carved out with a rented backhoe and some sweat. I started laying the foundation in late September. The weather was good then, cool mornings and warm afternoons, no bugs, no wind. I slept in my truck the first few nights and worked off a small generator and some battery lights when the sun dipped. I hauled in the lumber piece by piece, mostly from a local yard, and brought tools from home. I kept it all inside a locked metal box chained to a tree. I didn't trust anyone not to poke around, even that far out. By mid-October, I had the frame up. Walls were sheathed and tar-papered. No roof yet, but the bones were there, and it was starting to feel like a real place. I'd poured concrete footers, set the posts, even started roughing in a basic loft. It was simple but strong. Everything was level, square. Felt good. Felt like mine. Then the rain came. It wasn't supposed to be that kind of fall. Forecasts showed clear skies, and the ground was still warm. But the weather turned on me that third weekend. It started as a light mist in the early afternoon and stayed steady through the evening. I remember standing under a blue tarp I'd strung up between trees, eating a sandwich with my back to the wind, wondering if it'd clear up by morning. Didn't. By the next day, the mist had turned into cold, slanted rain. I had no cell service out there, no radar updates, just the sound of it beating against the plastic tarp and the half-built plywood walls. I tried to keep working, framing out the roof beams, but everything got slick. Tools slipped, gloves soaked through, and by mid-morning I gave up on roofing and started sealing off the door frame instead. I thought if I could get it closed up, I could sleep inside, maybe even stay dry. I didn't want to head back to town. I'd taken 4 days off for this trip, and I didn't want to waste it. I told myself I could tough it out. I slept in worse. By the time night came, the wind had picked up, and the rain turned heavy, constant. Everything was wet. My pants stuck to my legs. My boots were filled with water. The tarp ripped in one corner, and the trees creaked with every gust. I decided to sleep inside the shell of the cabin that night. I'd screwed a few boards across the window holes and draped the remaining tarp over the roof beams, trying to keep the worst of the water out. The floor was still rough plywood. I laid my sleeping bag down on a camping mat in the corner, where the ground sloped just a little. I kept the generator off to save fuel and used a small lantern instead, one of those dim yellow ones you hang up like a hook. The light barely reached the far corners. It was only about 7:30 when I laid down, but it was already pitch black outside. The trees were just shadows through the gaps in the wood. The rain kept tapping the tarp like someone drumming their fingers over and over. Couldn't sleep, not just because of the rain. Something felt off. First, I thought it was the cold. I kept shifting in my bag, adjusting my shirt, tucking in the sides to stay warm. But that wasn't it. It was the feeling, like I wasn't alone. I'd been out in the woods plenty before, hunting, camping, even overnight job sites. I knew the usual sounds: wind, owls, coyotes, the occasional deer crunching through the leaves. But that night, the silence between the rain was too quiet, too flat, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept my headlamp within reach just in case. I turned the lantern off and laid in the dark, listening. Somewhere around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, not fast, not stumbling, slow, steady. First, I thought it was a deer, maybe even a bear, but it was too deliberate. The steps had a rhythm, not 4 legs. 2, crunch, pause, crunch. They were close, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. I couldn't see anything. The rain blurred everything outside, and the tarp blocked most of the view anyway. But I could hear it, whoever it was, moving through the wet leaves. I didn't move. I just laid there, breathing shallow, trying to stay quiet. The steps circled once around the cabin, all the way around. Then they stopped behind the rear wall, the far side, the side I hadn't sealed yet. For a long time, there was nothing, just rain and wind. Then I heard it again, closer, just one step, then another. This time it was on the porch, well, the makeshift porch, just a pallet I'd set outside to hold supplies. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside the entrance. I stayed still, didn't even sit up. I just listened.
No flashlight, no voices, no knocks.
Just standing there. Eventually the steps moved off again. Not fast, just walked away, slowly, into the woods. I didn't sleep at all after that. I laid in the dark until the sky turned gray and the rain started to ease. When it was light enough to see, I got up and went outside. Everything was soaked. The ground was churned up in spots, but it was hard to tell what was new. I looked for footprints, but the rain had made everything mush. Still, I found something. Near the edge of the clearing, by a tree I hadn't touched, there was a boot print. Big, white, deep. It wasn't mine. I checked. My boots had a different tread, thinner lines, tighter pattern. This one was blocky, square. A thick heel. Work boot, maybe. It looked fresh. No pooling water in it yet.
No leaf debris.
I scanned the tree line, but everything was still. Just wet bark and drooping branches. I told myself it could have been an old print from one of the survey guys. Maybe someone passing through. But it didn't feel like that. I didn't see anyone that day, or the next, but I kept finding things. A broken branch that looked stepped on, freshly split, still green inside. A torn plastic wrapper near my supply box. Not mine. Some kind of candy I didn't bring. A mark on the plywood wall, 3 horizontal scrapes, just under the window, like someone dragged something sharp across it. Not deep, just enough to show. I tried to keep working, put the rest of the roof up, sealed the windows, focused on hammering, sawing, measuring. I kept my headphones in, music low, just enough to drown out the silence. But I kept checking behind me, every hour. Every sound made me pause. I set up trail cams on the trees near the edges of the clearing. One facing the path, one toward the creek.
Battery powered.
Motion sensitive, just to be sure. That last night it rained again, harder than before. I stayed inside the cabin, now mostly sealed. Still no insulation, no stove, just bare walls and a damp smell. But it felt safer than the truck. I bolted the door from inside with a steel bracket I'd installed, just in case. Around 1 a.m., the wind knocked something over outside. A loud thud. I jolted up, grabbed my light, and waited. My heart wouldn't stop pounding. Then silence again. I didn't check until morning. One of the sawhorses I'd left out had been tipped. But it wasn't the wind. There were scratches in the side of it, like fingernails. Not deep, just dragged across the grain. That was it. I packed my tools, locked the box, and drove back into town. I told myself I'd take a break, come back next week, maybe bring a buddy. When I got back, I pulled the memory cards from the trail cams. Most were blank, just trees shifting in the wind, except one. It triggered at 12:41 a.m. The image was blurry, taken in the rain, but I could make out the edge of the cabin, and something else. A man, part of a shoulder and a head, just at the edge of the frame, wearing a coat, hooded, standing still, facing the camera, not moving, just watching. The next frame was empty. I haven't seen him since. I finished the cabin a few weeks later, brought a friend with me the next few times, carried a rifle even though it felt like overkill. Nothing else happened. No more prints, no more sounds. I still go out there now and then. The cabin's dry and warm, a good place to get away. But I always lock the door. I always check the cameras. And I never forget that first rainy night, lying in the dark, while someone walked circles around the walls I built. I don't know who he was, but he knew I was there, and he came back. It was a cool morning in late October, the kind of chill that settles into your bones but doesn't quite freeze you. The sky was a soft, pale gray, heavy with clouds that promised rain but hadn't quite broken yet. I was driving a long stretch of 2-lane road, somewhere deep in northern Vermont, not far from the Canadian border. The trees on either side were a patchwork of burnt orange, dark red, and fading yellow leaves, thick with the weight of the season's end. I wasn't sure why I was here, not really. The drive was supposed to be simple, a way to clear my head after weeks of restless nights and half-finished mornings. But something about this road made me tense. Maybe it was the way the landscape felt so untouched, like it hadn't changed in decades. Maybe it was the memory of the cabin I was about to pass, the cabin that once belonged to my ex-wife, Claire. We had been married for 8 years before it all fell apart. The cabin was built by her grandfather, a weathered structure that had seen too many storms, too many long winters. It sat alone at the edge of a small lake, surrounded by dense pine forest. I'd been there a few times with her, some good times, some not. Now, years later, it was hers still, but I was no longer part of that world. The road curved sharply, and I slowed down as the trees opened to reveal the cabin in the distance. It was almost hidden, half swallowed by the thick forest. The lake was just behind it, its surface glassy and motionless this morning. The wooden exterior was worn, the paint faded to a dull gray, shingles missing in places. It looked forgotten, like a relic from a time that had moved on without me. I didn't want to stop. The cabin was off limits to me now, and the thought of going near it made my chest tighten. But passing it was unavoidable on this route, and I found myself looking harder at it than I planned. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, mixed with the faint scent of smoke from a distant chimney. I could almost hear the crackle of a fire from inside the cabin, even though I knew it was empty. The silence felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I kept driving, but my eyes kept flicking back to the cabin. I remembered walking those rough wooden floors, the way Claire's eyes would light up when she talked about fixing it up. She had always wanted to make it a home, a place away from everything, but I was never part of that dream. As the road stretched ahead, the sun tried to push through the clouds, casting a dull, gray light over the landscape. The trees pressed closer now, their branches reaching over the road like fingers. The leaves scattered in the wind, and I caught a glimpse of movement, something quick and low, darting between the trunks. I blinked and it was gone. Maybe a deer, maybe just my imagination. I tried to shake off the unease growing in my chest. The miles ticked by, but my thoughts stayed fixed on the cabin. The more I thought about it, the heavier my heart felt. The memories weren't all bad, but they were tangled in a web of regret and pain. Claire had been my world once. We had planned a future there, in that quiet place far from the noise. But life had other plans. The road narrowed suddenly, the trees so close now I could see the rough bark, moss growing thick on the trunks. I slowed again, noticing how the asphalt had cracked and buckled, roots pushing through the surface like something angry trying to break free. A few 100 feet ahead, the road curved sharply to the left, and then I saw it again, the cabin, but closer this time. It looked smaller, more fragile. The windows were dark, some cracked. The door sagged slightly on its hinges. A faded, no trespassing sign hung crookedly by the side. I swallowed hard. For a moment, I wanted to stop and look closer, to see if there was anything left inside that reminded me of her, of us. But the knot in my throat tightened, and I pressed down on the gas, pushing past it. The forest grew darker here, thicker. The sky was almost completely covered with clouds now, a dull, heavy gray that made everything feel muted and cold. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin shrink behind me, swallowed by the trees again. The road stretched on, empty except for the occasional rustle of leaves. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural, like the forest itself was watching. I pulled the collar of my jacket higher around my neck, feeling exposed in a way I hadn't before. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, just off the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the trees. But it was real. A man, tall and thin, wearing a worn coat and a cap pulled low over his face. He stood perfectly still, watching me as I slowed down. His eyes were hidden in shadow, but I felt them burning into me. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The man didn't move, didn't even blink. He just stood there like he belonged there, like he had been waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I looked away, trying to keep my eyes on the road. When I glanced back, he was gone. I told myself I must have imagined it, or maybe he slipped back into the trees. But the feeling lingered, an unease that settled deep in my gut. The road stretched ahead, winding through the forest and hills. I drove faster, eager to leave this place behind. But the memory of that man stayed with me, like a shadow in the corners of my mind. Later, when I stopped at a small diner in the next town, I asked around about the cabin. The locals were polite but closed off. No one seemed eager to talk about it. One old man muttered something about strangers showing up and things that shouldn't be seen. I pressed, but he just shook his head and looked away. Driving back to the highway, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that man again. But the road was empty. The forest stood silent and still. The rest of the day passed in a blur. My thoughts kept circling back to the cabin, to the memories it held, to the man I saw standing there. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like a warning or maybe a reminder that some places hold more than just memories. When I finally pulled into my driveway that night, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The past was behind me, but it wasn't gone. Not really. The cabin, the forest, the man. Each was a piece of a story I couldn't forget, no matter how far I drove or how fast I tried to run. I was 32 years old the summer I took the seasonal ranger job at Pine Ridge National Forest in northern Idaho. The year was 1998. I had spent most of my life around forests and mountains. My father was a forestry worker, so I was familiar with the routines of forest work. But this job was something else. It wasn't just patrols or trail maintenance. I was assigned to stay in the old ranger cabin near the edge of the park, alone, for the entire summer. The idea was to monitor a remote section of the forest where a few hikers had recently reported suspicious activity. The Park Service thought it might be some kind of illegal hunting or drug operation, but nothing had been confirmed. The cabin itself was a small wooden structure built in the 1930s. It was perched on a hill surrounded by dense pine trees and overlooking a wide valley. The roof sagged a little and the windows had single panes, some cracked, but the place was solid. I liked it. It had an old stove, a woodpile stacked neatly outside, a cot, a table, and a desk with a small radio for emergency communication. There was no electricity or running water, so I had to rely on the creek a short walk away for water and my battery-powered lanterns for light. I arrived in early June. The air was fresh, cold at night, and the forest smelled like pine needles and wet earth. I unpacked my gear carefully: food, clothes, a first aid kit, maps, a notebook, and a small rifle for protection. I'd been trained for this kind of job. But even so, I felt the weight of isolation settle over me as I closed the cabin door behind me the first night. The first week was quiet. I spent my days walking the trails, checking the condition of signs, and noting any animal tracks. At night, I kept a fire going outside the cabin and listened to the forest sounds. Owl calls, rustling branches, the occasional howl of a distant coyote. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected, but the peace started to wear thin. On the 8th day, I found signs that something wasn't right. While patrolling the northern ridge near the creek, I spotted fresh tire tracks on a narrow dirt road that wasn't on any official map. They looked recent, maybe from the last night or early morning. The tracks were wide, from some kind of heavy vehicle, but I had never seen any authorized trucks or cars use that route. I marked the spot carefully in my notebook and decided to investigate more the next day. The next morning, I followed the tire tracks up the old road. The forest grew thicker, darker. Branches scraped my jacket, and the air smelled damp and earthy. After about a mile, I came across a small clearing. There were piles of wood stacked in a messy heap, some cut logs, and scattered pieces of metal and plastic. Something had definitely been here recently, but there was no one in sight. I took photos with my small camera and noted everything carefully. I returned to the cabin, feeling uneasy. There was a tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, the wind picked up and rattled the cabin windows. I lit my lanterns inside and double-checked that my rifle was close by. The radio crackled faintly, but there was no other signal. Over the following days, the strange signs increased. More tire tracks appeared, along with fresh footprints that didn't match any known animals. They were too large and too deep for a human, but the prints had a rough, irregular shape, as if someone had been walking heavily on soft ground wearing uneven boots. The forest seemed quieter too, less bird songs, fewer animals. One evening, just before dusk, I spotted movement near the tree line across the clearing. I couldn't make out details, just a shadowy figure slipping between the trunks. My heart beat faster. I stayed still and waited, but it disappeared quickly, leaving only broken twigs and disturbed leaves. I spent that night on high alert. The forest noises felt sharper and closer, but no one came near the cabin. I locked the doors and windows as tightly as possible and kept my rifle close. The following morning, I found more evidence of recent activity. Fresh footprints around the cabin itself. Whoever had been here had circled the place but never came close enough to see inside. That was unnerving. I wrote a detailed report and tried to call the ranger station on the radio, but all I got was static. The remote location made communication difficult. Days passed. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I began to check outside more often, shining my flashlight into the trees and listening for any sound. Once, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel, but when I looked out, there was nothing. The isolation gnawed at me. I had no company except for the occasional deer or squirrel, and the nights dragged on. I kept my fire burning longer and made sure the woodpile was well stocked. Then one morning, I woke to find my supplies disturbed. My food box was open, and some cans were moved. I was sure I had locked everything the night before. Someone had been in my cabin while I slept. That was the moment fear truly set in. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I double-checked the locks and moved my rifle closer. I spent the day watching the forest from the small porch, eyes scanning the shadows. The next night was restless. I woke several times to noises outside, a rustling in the bushes, distant footsteps, and once, a sharp snap of a branch. I sat up quietly, holding my rifle, trying to listen. The darkness felt thick and suffocating. Just before dawn, I heard something different. Whispers, faint and hard to understand, carried by the wind. They didn't sound like normal voices, more like murmurs or low growls. I could not tell if it was an animal or a person. When daylight finally broke, I found a new set of footprints leading away from the cabin toward the road I had discovered earlier. The footprints were deep and wide, just like before. I realized then that I wasn't alone in these woods. Someone was watching me, maybe hunting me. But why? What were they doing out here? I decided to prepare to leave. I packed my essential gear, stacked wood to make the fire look like I was still there, and set a simple tripwire alarm around the cabin using cans and string I had found in my pack. It was primitive, but it might warn me if someone approached. That afternoon, I started the long hike back to the ranger station, sticking to the main trails and avoiding the back roads. The walk was tense. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive. I kept checking behind me, but no one followed. When I finally reached the station late in the evening, I was exhausted and shaken. I reported everything I had found and experienced in detail. The rangers took me seriously and launched an investigation. Weeks later, they discovered an illegal logging operation in the same area I had been patrolling. The men involved were armed and dangerous, hiding deep in the forest, watching for anyone who might discover them. I was lucky to get out when I did. The Park Service increased patrols and removed the illegal operators. The cabin was abandoned afterward, deemed too risky to use again. I never returned to Pine Ridge. The forest, the silence, and the feeling of being hunted stayed with me long after I left. It wasn't ghosts or monsters that scared me, just real people doing bad things in a place where no one should be disturbed. It was late October, 1997. I was 29, living in northern Vermont, working a job that mostly meant long hours on a computer in a small-town office. I needed a break, some fresh air, some quiet, time to clear my mind. The city noise and stress had been building for months, and I couldn't think straight anymore. I found the cabin online, a small old place tucked away deep in the Green Mountains, far from any roads or towns. The ad said it was perfect for hunters or anyone wanting to get away. No electricity, no running water, just the bare essentials and lots of pine trees. I rented it for a week. I packed a backpack with canned food, water bottles, a small camping stove, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a hunting knife. No cell phone service out there. That was part of the draw. The drive itself was nerve-wracking. The last 5 miles were on a dirt road that got narrower and rougher the further I went. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches reaching out like claws over the road. I saw a few rusted-out cars abandoned by the roadside. The silence in the woods was thick, almost loud in its emptiness. When I finally reached the cabin, I noticed it was older than the pictures showed. The wood was weathered, cracked in places. The porch sagged under years of snow and rain. There was a small chimney, but no smoke. No signs of recent life except for some footprints in the dirt mine and maybe one other set, but they were faint. I parked my truck and unloaded my gear slowly. The air smelled like pine sap and damp earth. The sun was setting, and the shadows grew long and cold. I moved inside the cabin. The floorboards creaked under my boots. The room was small, maybe 15 by 15 feet, with a wood stove in the corner, a rickety table, and 2 chairs. A single window looked out into the trees. I set down my pack and lit the stove, coaxing a fire from dry wood stacked nearby. The warmth felt good, but there was a cold chill under my skin I couldn't shake. I spent the first night restless. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, sometimes rattling the cabin like it might fall apart. I heard twigs snap. Something moved just beyond the window, but when I looked, I saw only shadows and branches. The next morning, I decided to explore. I walked through the woods, noticing the forest floor covered in old leaves, pine needles, and broken branches. The silence was heavy. No birds sang, no animals stirred. It was like the forest was holding its breath. About a quarter mile from the cabin, I found something strange. A shallow hole dug in the dirt, covered with leaves. I knelt and poked it with a stick. It looked fresh. My heart beat faster. I pushed the leaves aside and saw a dark shape beneath. I pulled back more leaves, revealing a pair of worn boots. I swallowed hard and kept clearing away dirt and leaves. I uncovered a human hand, pale and stiff. I stepped back, my breath short, my hands trembling. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but the more I uncovered, the clearer it became. It was a dead body, buried hastily in the forest. Clothes torn, face caked in dirt, skin pale from being underground. I ran back to the cabin, grabbed my coat, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could. I called the police from a gas station in the nearest town. They told me to stay put and that they would come out the next day. Couldn't sleep that night. The forest felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. I imagined whoever this person was, how they died, and who had buried them there. The police arrived early the next morning, 2 officers and a detective. They followed me to the spot and began digging with proper tools. They confirmed the body was male, likely in his late 20s, and had been dead for months. The detective said they'd investigate, but asked me many questions about the cabin, the road, and if I'd seen anyone suspicious. I told them no, except for the footprints around the cabin, which I hadn't followed up on. Over the next few days, I stayed in the cabin under police orders to not disturb anything. I kept watch, always alert for movement in the woods. The stillness made me paranoid. I found more signs of someone else having been near the cabin. Broken branches, footprints larger than mine, and small piles of stones arranged oddly. One afternoon, I found a makeshift trap near the cabin. A snare made from wire, hidden in the brush. I didn't set it up, but it looked like someone was still using this area, maybe for hunting or worse. The police brought in search dogs, but they lost the trail near the cabin. The detective said the killer might still be out there. The thought chilled me more than the cold mountain air. On the last night, I was packing to leave. The wind had picked up and rain started pounding the tin roof. I double-checked the cabin, locking windows and doors. I wanted to get out of there before dark. As I turned to leave the cabin for one last look outside, I saw something near the edge of the forest. A figure standing still, watching me. I froze. The figure didn't move, just stared. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, or if it was even real. Then the figure slowly stepped back into the shadows and vanished. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag and ran to my truck, starting the engine with trembling hands. The headlights cut through the rain as I sped down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the dead man in the woods. The police later told me they found more bodies, all buried in shallow graves in the forest around the cabin. They never caught the killer. I haven't been back since. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those eyes watching me from the trees, waiting. The summer of 1997 was one I'll never forget, though I wish I could. I was 28 and thought I could handle anything. I had been working in the city for years, stuck in a dull routine of office work and weekends that blurred together. When my uncle died unexpectedly, he left me his cabin up in northern Minnesota, near a town called Eerie, right on the edge of the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. It was the kind of place where cell phones didn't work and the roads turned to dirt miles before the nearest gas station. I had never been much of an outdoorsman, but I figured spending a couple of weeks there, away from everything, might be good for me. The cabin wasn't fancy. A small wooden shack with peeling paint and a sagging porch, but it was mine now. I packed my old backpack, grabbed some basic supplies, and drove up there alone, excited for a break from the city's noise. The drive was long, winding through thick forests and past lakes so still they looked like glass. I remember the air changing as I got closer, fresher, cooler, and carrying the scent of pine and earth. When I arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows over the cabin. The place felt still, almost silent except for the occasional call of a loon from the lake nearby. The cabin sat about a quarter mile from the dirt road, surrounded by towering spruce and birch trees. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. Inside was sparse. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a cot in the corner, and shelves lined with dusty jars and cans. A few old tools hung on the walls. The windows were dirty but gave me a clear view of the forest outside. That first night was quiet but uneasy. I built a fire in the stove and tried to settle in. The only sounds were the wind through the trees and the crackle of burning wood. I didn't hear any animals, just the deep silence that felt almost unnatural. I lay on the cot and listened until I drifted off. The next day, I explored a little around the cabin. I found a path that led down to the lake, where the water was cold and clear. I skipped stones and watched the sky reflect on the surface. The woods felt vast and untouched, like time had stopped here. I thought about my uncle, a man who had lived alone in this cabin for years, and wondered what his life was like. On the third day, the weather turned. Gray clouds rolled in, and rain started falling in steady sheets. The forest changed sound then. The rain made the leaves drip and the dirt paths muddy. I stayed inside mostly, reading an old book I found on the shelf, but that night I noticed something strange. Outside the cabin window, in the fading light, I thought I saw movement. At first, I assumed it was a deer or some other animal, but the shape was too tall, too slow, and deliberate. I stared through the dirty glass, but it vanished before I could make out anything. I shrugged it off as a trick of the light. The fourth day was even worse weather, heavy rain and wind that shook the cabin. The power was obviously non-existent, so I relied on my flashlight and the wood stove for heat. Around midday, I heard a noise outside that stopped me cold. It was a sharp crack, like a branch breaking, followed by a crunching sound. It didn't come from the usual forest animals. It was heavier, more deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door just enough to look out. The rain blurred my view, but I caught sight of footprints in the mud, large and uneven, heading toward the cabin. They weren't human, but not animal either. They looked like boots, worn and heavy, but only one set. I hadn't seen any other people since I arrived. Panic started to rise. I checked my supplies, food, water, my knife, and thought about what I should do. I considered leaving immediately, but the road was slippery and I wasn't sure I could get my car out in the rain. That night, I locked the door and stayed close to the stove, listening. The forest felt alive with sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But there was something else, a faint scraping noise, like someone dragging something heavy through the underbrush. It moved slowly, circling the cabin. Sleep was impossible. The next morning, the rain stopped, but a thick fog had settled over the area. I tried to stay calm and pack up to leave. As I gathered my things, I noticed something disturbing. My old pickup truck, parked near the road, had deep scratches all down the driver's side. The paint was gouged, and the window had been cracked. Fear gripped me harder now. Someone had been near my truck, close enough to damage it. I realized my phone had no signal, so calling for help wasn't an option. I decided I had to walk down the road to the nearest town, a few miles away, hoping to find help. I packed a small bag and left the cabin locked behind me. The fog thickened, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The forest around me felt oppressive, like I was being watched. Halfway down the road, I stopped. There were more footprints in the mud, larger than mine, heading the same way. But I didn't see anyone. My heart pounded. Every crack and snap made me jump. I moved faster, my boots sinking into the wet earth. The road stretched endlessly, twisting and turning between the trees. Suddenly, I heard a shout in the distance, rough and urgent. My breath caught. I froze, scanning the fog. No one appeared, but the sound repeated, closer this time. It wasn't a shout for help. It was something else, something aggressive. I broke into a run, tripping over roots and slipping on mud. The sound followed me, echoing through the trees. My mind raced with every possible explanation. A lost hunter, someone drunk, or worse. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station at the edge of town. It was open, and a woman behind the counter looked at me with concern as I burst in, soaking wet and out of breath. I told her about the cabin, the footprints, the truck, the noises. She nodded slowly and told me that lately, there had been reports of a man living rough in the woods, someone dangerous who had been scaring locals and damaging property. The police had been looking but never found him. I stayed the night in town, feeling safe for the first time in days. The next morning, I called a friend who drove up to pick me and my truck. The damage was bad, but the vehicle was still drivable. When I went back with the police later, the cabin was empty and untouched. No signs of anyone inside except the footprints in the mud outside. The man was never caught, I never went back. That experience taught me how fragile safety really is when you're alone in the wilderness. It's not ghosts or monsters you have to fear. Sometimes it's just another human being, lost or dangerous, with no one around to stop them. The woods are beautiful, but they are also wild and unpredictable. And sometimes that's the scariest thing of all. I never wanted to visit my boss's cabin. The thought alone made me uneasy, though I never said it aloud. It was the summer of 2013, and I was 27 years old, working a job I didn't particularly love but needed. My boss, Martin, was a man of few words, maybe late 40s, with a gruff manner that didn't invite many questions. One afternoon, Martin casually mentioned that his family cabin on Red Pine Ridge was having some issues. He needed someone to check on it, make sure everything was all right, maybe fix a few small things. He asked if I could drive out there and spend a couple of days. I agreed because, honestly, I didn't have much else going on, and it was an opportunity to get away from the noise of the city. I figured it would be an easy job, a few repairs, a little cleaning, and then back home. What I didn't expect was how isolated, dark, and unsettling the place was, or how those 2 days would stretch into something far more complicated. The drive out to Red Pine Ridge was long and slow. The cabin was about 3 hours away from the city, deep in the woods of northern Montana. The highway gave way to a rough gravel road after about an hour, and eventually, the path narrowed to barely wide enough for a single car. Pines towered on either side, thick and close, their branches blocking much of the sunlight. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles crushed under tires. I had Martin's old Ford pickup, a rusted but reliable truck with a cracked dashboard and a smell of old cigarette smoke. The sun was starting to dip as I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood. It was a squat, wooden structure, faded brown with patches of moss climbing its sides. The windows were small and dirty, some cracked, and the door hung slightly off its hinges. The place looked abandoned, not just empty but forgotten. I remembered Martin saying the cabin hadn't been used much in years. His family came there only during the summers, usually for hunting season or brief weekends. This year, no one had been out here. I grabbed my backpack from the truck bed, took a flashlight and some tools Martin had packed for me, and stepped inside. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. The floorboards creaked underfoot. I ran a hand over a windowsill coated in dead bugs and cobwebs. The cabin smelled of damp wood and something faintly sour, like old sweat left in fabric. The furniture was sparse. A rickety table, 2 chairs, a sagging bed frame, and a small wood stove in the corner. I set to work. The first thing was to check the stove. It looked like it hadn't been used since last winter, with ashes cold and untouched. I cleaned out the firebox, stacked some dry wood I found in the shed, and set to work inspecting the cabin's wiring. There was no electricity connected. Martin had made it clear the cabin was off-grid. Power came from a small generator stored in the shed. I located the generator, checked its fuel, and found it was half empty but still usable. That night, I built a fire in the stove, boiled some water on a camping stove I brought with me, and sat in the dim light trying to relax. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence was total except for the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and somewhere far away, a coyote howled. I found it hard to sleep. The next day was warmer, with sunlight cutting through the forest canopy in bright slants. I worked methodically, fixing the broken door hinge with some tools from my kit, tightening loose boards, and patching small holes in the windows with plastic sheeting. While doing this, I noticed signs of recent animal activity, fresh tracks in the dirt around the cabin, scat from what I guessed was either a raccoon or a stray dog. In the afternoon, I explored the small clearing around the cabin. I found a well, capped but old. The water pump beside it was broken, which explained why Martin wanted someone to check on things. The pump had been temperamental in the past. I tried to fix it, but quickly realized I needed parts one didn't have. I marked it down as something to report. As the sun fell, I returned inside, and the loneliness wrapped around me like a thick blanket. I couldn't shake a growing sense that I was being watched. The woods were silent in the daylight, but in the dusk, the shadows moved strangely. Every little noise made me jump. A branch cracking, a bird calling, even my own breathing felt loud. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the cabin walls. I wrapped myself in an old blanket and sat near the stove, the fire burning low. Then I heard it, footsteps outside, crunching on the dead leaves, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart hammering. I grabbed my flashlight and walked quietly to the window, shining the beam out into the dark. The forest was black, thick and unreadable, but for a second, I thought I saw a figure moving between the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a large bird, but something about the sound felt off. Heavier, slower, more careful. I stayed up most of the night listening. At one point, I heard a low rustling near the shed. My mind played tricks, making me imagine shadows creeping along the walls, whispering voices. But there was nothing except the cold night and the trees swaying outside. Morning came slowly. I was exhausted but determined to finish my task. I went out to the shed to inspect the generator again. As I approached, I saw fresh footprints in the mud, larger than mine, with deep tread marks. They weren't animal prints. Someone had been here, maybe during the night. My stomach sank. I checked the generator and found it had been tampered with. The fuel line was cut. Whoever had come here wanted to disable it. That made no sense. Why sabotage an old cabin that barely anyone used? I spent the day finishing the repairs I could and writing down everything to tell Martin. When evening came, I packed up most of my tools, ready to leave in the morning. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, that I wasn't alone, that the woods were hiding something watching me. That night was worse. The footsteps came back, this time closer, pacing around the cabin in slow circles. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call anyone. The flashlight was my only defense, but I knew it would be useless if whoever was outside decided to come closer. At one point, I caught the beam of light reflecting off a window, eyes staring back at me. The shape was tall and thin, moving just out of reach of the light. I felt trapped, like a small animal cornered in a cage. I stayed awake until dawn, my body tense, every muscle ready to bolt. When the sun finally rose, I grabbed my things and left the cabin, my heart pounding. Back in town, I told Martin everything. He listened quietly, then sighed. He admitted the cabin had been broken into a few times over the years. People came looking for something, though he never said what. Some locals believed the land was cursed, but Martin didn't believe in that. He told me to stay away from the place and that he'd handle it. I never went back, but even now, years later, I remember the heavy silence of the woods, the feeling of eyes watching from the shadows, and the long, lonely nights by the cold fire in that forgotten cabin on Red Pine Ridge. I was 32 when I took that job in northern Arizona, outside a little town called Taylor. It was 2016, early fall. I had been working in construction most of my life, but this was the first time I'd agreed to something like this. Isolated solo cabin work, deep in the woods, far from people. My boss, George, needed someone to head out to this remote plot of land and finish framing and sealing a half-built hunting cabin before winter rolled in. The client had money but no patience, and George promised me a nice bonus if I stayed out there until it was done. I didn't have much tying me down then. No girlfriend, no kids, no real plans. I figured a few weeks in the quiet might do me good. George dropped me off in his truck with 2 weeks worth of supplies, a .22 rifle in case I ran into anything wild, and the keys to a rusted-out red trailer with a bed and propane stove. No cell service out there. The nearest paved road was about 15 miles away. He gave me a radio that barely worked and said he'd be back in a week to check in. The first few days were easy. I got up at dawn, ate canned food, drank from the well pump, and worked until the sun dipped low behind the pines. The forest was dense, thick pines and juniper, low ridges, loose rock. Coyotes yipped at night, and every so often I'd hear something big moving through the brush. Elk, I thought. Once I caught a black bear sniffing around the trash, but it took off as soon as I made noise. That fourth night is when things started to feel off. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, just listening to the wind in the trees. It had picked up around midnight, and I could hear the trailer creaking. Then, underneath that, I heard a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, barely there, but it stopped the breath in my lungs. It was a tapping, just one soft tap and then silence. A minute later, another. It wasn't like something hitting the trailer by accident. It was too precise, too deliberate. I lay there, holding my breath, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. Another tap came, this one on the side window. Slow and gentle. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I waited, listening. After 10 minutes, nothing else came. Just the wind again. I tried to tell myself it was a branch or maybe something small brushing against the glass. But in the morning, when I stepped outside, I checked the side of the trailer. There were no low branches anywhere near that window. Nothing that could have touched the glass without being held there. I went about my work, tried to push the thought away, but I noticed I started looking over my shoulder more often, scanning the tree line. I catch myself standing still for no reason, just listening. On the 6th day, just after lunch, I found tracks near the edge of the clearing. At first I thought they were mine, but the shape was wrong. I was wearing heavy-soled work boots. These prints were narrow, long, almost barefoot. The toes splayed wide. Whatever made them wasn't wearing shoes. They led from the forest toward the cabin, then veered off and disappeared behind a thicket of manzanita. I told myself someone was messing with me. Maybe some hiker got turned around. Maybe someone lived off-grid out here. It was stupid to jump to conclusions. But still, I didn't feel right. I started sleeping with the rifle next to me, and I locked the trailer door, even though it barely held shut with that old latch. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining the shape of those tracks in the dirt. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps outside. Not animals, not scurrying or thumping. Human footsteps, slow, crunching ones on dead pine needles. They circled the trailer, stopped, moved again. I didn't open the door. I didn't even sit up. I just gripped the rifle and waited until dawn. The next morning, I found the dirt disturbed around the back of the trailer. The same tracks again, but this time they were closer, right up against the wall, as if someone had pressed their face to the metal and looked inside. I found a smudge on the window.
No prints.
Just a faint oval where something had touched the glass. That day, I worked with one eye on the trees. I barely got anything done. When it started getting dark, I packed up early and bolted the trailer from the inside. I didn't light the lantern. I sat there in the dark with the rifle on my lap, listening to the wind outside. Just after midnight, I heard it again. First the footsteps, then the tapping. Not just one tap this time, 3 taps, then silence, then 2 more. They moved from window to window like someone testing the glass. I didn't move, couldn't. My body felt locked. Every hair on my arms was standing straight up. Then the footsteps moved around to the front. The latch on the door rattled. They were trying to get in. I raised the rifle, heart hammering, sweat pouring down my back. But the rattling stopped after a few seconds. Then silence. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, the ground was churned up with those same bare footprints. They led from the woods, circled the trailer twice, then vanished back into the trees. Some of them looked different this time, more distorted, like the toes were longer, or like they'd been dragging. I kept trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe some crazy hermit, maybe a prank, maybe I was just losing it out there in the quiet. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. This thing, whatever it wasn't right. It moved like a man but didn't leave prints like one. It made noises like it wanted me to know it was out there. When George came to check on me that afternoon, I nearly broke down. I told him I needed more ammo. I didn't tell him everything. I didn't want him thinking I'd gone soft, but I made it clear something wasn't right. He laughed it off, said people out there tell stories about witch coyotes and forest ghosts, said I was probably just hearing things. But he gave me more rounds and he left me a spotlight. That night I didn't hear anything. For the first time in days it was quiet, but the quiet didn't last. 2 nights later, I woke up to a sound I'll never forget. Not footsteps, not tapping, but a voice. It was my own voice. It was outside the trailer calling my name. I sat up, frozen. The voice was perfect, same tone, same pitch, but the rhythm was wrong. It stretched my name out too long. The way it said it didn't sound like a person talking. It sounded like someone trying to mimic speech, like a recording played through broken speakers. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. The voice kept going, now saying random things I'd said out loud earlier that week. Phrases I'd spoken to myself while working. Hearing them repeated back, slow and broken, made my skin crawl. It was standing just outside the trailer, copying my own words back at me in that flat, mechanical way. Kept doing it for an hour. Then it stopped, and I heard the door handle turn again. I slept with my back against the far wall that night, rifle raised. The thing didn't come in, but I didn't sleep. At dawn, I opened the door. The ground was a mess, prints everywhere. I followed them to the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw it for the first time. It was crouched under a tree, maybe 30 yards away. Thin, naked, grayish skin, long arms, legs bent wrong. Its face was wrong, too narrow, too smooth, but its eyes were what stopped me. Human eyes. They locked onto mine. I didn't raise the rifle. I didn't move. Couldn't. We stared at each other for a few seconds, and then it stood up, slowly, taller than any man I've ever seen. It didn't run. It didn't rush. It just turned and walked into the trees, like it wasn't afraid. That day I packed everything. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about the money. I loaded what I could onto the ATV and left the rest. I drove until I hit the dirt road, then kept going until I got signal. I called George, told him I was done. He picked me up 2 hours later. I didn't say much, neither did he. A week later, he sent someone else to finish the job. That guy stayed 2 nights, then quit. He wouldn't tell George why. I never went back. I moved to Oregon 6 months later, got a job with a company in Bend. I don't talk about what happened out there. Most people wouldn't believe it. I still don't know what I saw, but it wasn't a man, and it wasn't an animal. Whatever it was, it knew how to move like us. It knew how to make sounds like us. It watched me. It learned me, and I believe it wanted to become me. I haven't camped alone since. I don't go into the woods without company. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I think I can still hear the sound of my own voice calling from the trees. But I don't answer it. Not anymore. I was 32 the year I decided to take a break from everything. It was autumn 2016, and things in my life felt like they were cracking from the inside out. Work was a mess. My long-term relationship had ended just months before, and the city was starting to make me feel boxed in, like the walls were always closing. I lived in Derby back then, but I couldn't stand another day of looking at the same streets, the same traffic, the same routine. I booked a small rental cabin in the Peak District. It wasn't far in terms of distance, just an hour and a half by car, but it felt like a world away. It was isolated enough to make me feel alone, which was exactly what I thought I needed. A small wooden cabin surrounded by trees and walking trails. No internet, no mobile signal, and just one narrow road leading in and out. The place was called Millstone Wood Cabin, hidden off a barely marked gravel road that twisted through trees and shallow hills. When I arrived on a Thursday morning, the sky was heavy with clouds and the air had that damp, earthy smell that only deep countryside seems to hold. The leaves had already started to turn, and the sound of them crunching under my boots felt oddly comforting. The cabin itself was basic. One bedroom, a small living room with a wood burner, a kitchenette, and a bathroom with weak water pressure. There was a loft up top, too, empty except for a rolled-up mat and some cobwebs. The outside had a wraparound porch and a single bench facing the woods.
No TV.
No radio, just a few books left behind by previous visitors and a notebook filled with handwritten entries from people who had stayed there before. Most of them wrote about the peace, the silence, the walking trails. That's what I had come for, too. The first 2 days were just what I'd hoped. I spent hours hiking through the hills, taking photos of mossy stones and mist hanging low over the trees. I cooked simple meals, drank tea by the fire, and wrote in a cheap notebook I'd brought with me. I didn't miss my phone once. It was on the third evening that things started to feel off. It had been raining since morning, a thin, cold drizzle that made everything look gray and tired. I stayed in most of the day, reading and writing, occasionally stepping out to smoke under the porch roof. Around dusk, I noticed something odd, a shape through the trees, just a shape at first. I was standing at the window, holding a mug of tea, when I saw it, a pale shape between two trees, maybe 30 feet from the cabin. It didn't move. I thought maybe it was a stone or some trick of light. The trees out there were dense, and shadows could do strange things. But then I saw it again the next day. This time it was morning, and the rain had let up. I was standing outside on the porch, stretching my legs before going for a walk, when I saw it, that same shape, that same pale tone. It was a woman, at least I thought it was. She was far enough away that I couldn't see her face. She stood still between two trees, like she had just stepped out of the woods and forgotten what for. She wasn't dressed for the weather. A long beige coat, hanging down to her calves, and something white beneath it. Her hair was long and dark, stringy and wet from the rain. She didn't move, not once. I stared at her for maybe 10 seconds, expecting her to wave or speak or move, but she just stood there. And then I blinked, looked down to set my mug on the bench, and when I looked back, she was gone. I walked a little closer, out to the tree line. Nothing. No sound except wet leaves and the occasional bird. I didn't hear branches break. No footsteps. No rustling. She was just gone. I told myself it was a local out for a walk. Maybe a neighbor from one of the scattered farms or cottages nearby. But that didn't sit right. She hadn't looked like she was walking. She looked like she was watching. And the direction she came from, there was nothing out there. Just hills, trees, and more trees. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing noises. Not inside the cabin, but outside. Faint crunching of leaves, soft steps circling the porch. Once I thought I heard a hand brush against the wall. Just a soft scrape. I froze in bed and held my breath, staring up at the wooden ceiling, heart pounding like a drum. But when I got up and checked, there was nothing. No one. I should have left then, packed my bag and gone. But I told myself I was being paranoid. It was just isolation playing tricks on me. Too much time alone, too much silence, too much imagination. The fifth day was cold and dry. I went for a longer walk, trying to shake off the nerves. The path behind the cabin led uphill, through older trees and rocky ridges. I walked for maybe an hour before I turned back, and that's when I found something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. In the mud. Small, narrow, like a woman's. They came from deep in the woods and led toward the cabin. No other signs, no bike tracks, no boots, no dogs, just those steps. I followed them with my eyes until they faded into the leaves. Back at the cabin, I checked the door twice. Locked. I moved a chair under the handle anyway. I didn't sleep that night either. The wind picked up around midnight and howled through the trees like voices. But there was something else. A sound that cut through it all, fingernails. I'm sure of it. Fingernails dragging slowly across the cabin wall, like she was circling again. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I saw were smudges on the window. Not fingerprints, just streaks, like someone had wiped a wet cloth or sleeve across the glass. That morning, I finally gave in. I packed my bag, loaded it into the car, and started the engine. I didn't care if it was just nerves or some weird coincidence. I wasn't staying another night, but the car wouldn't start. It wasn't the battery. The lights came on, the dashboard lit up. It just wouldn't turn over. No sputter, no click, nothing. Like someone had pulled something from the engine. I opened the hood and stood there staring like I knew what I was looking for. I didn't, but something looked off. One of the hoses was cut. Not worn, not cracked, cut, clean. I stayed in the car for almost half an hour, hands on the wheel, eyes locked on the rearview mirror. Every time I thought I saw something move, I gripped the wheel tighter. Eventually, I got out and went back into the cabin. I locked the door, blocked the windows with pillows and towels. I moved the chair back under the doorknob. I didn't eat that day, just drank water and listened. That night was worse. The sounds started earlier, maybe around 10 p.m. Slow footsteps on the porch, a scrape against the wall, then silence. Then again, more footsteps, softer this time, like bare feet. Around midnight, I heard the doorknob shift. Not shake, just a single slow turn. But the chair held. I didn't move. I lay still in bed, holding my breath, gripping a flashlight like a weapon. I didn't sleep. At some point, I must have dozed off from sheer exhaustion, because I woke up to light in the sky. I jumped out of bed and checked everything. The door was still blocked. No one was inside. But when I stepped outside, something caught my eye near the base of the porch. A scarf. Beige. Soaked through, muddy, twisted around a branch like it had been dropped or left behind. I didn't touch it. I didn't move it. I just stared. I walked 5 miles to the nearest farm that morning. I left the car behind. When I reached the farmhouse, the woman who answered looked surprised to see me. I told her I'd been staying at the cabin. She said something strange then. Said the cabin hadn't been rented in months. Said the usual owner had pulled it from listings back in August. I told her I'd booked it online, showed her the email. She frowned, said she didn't know who'd made the listing. I left the keys with her and took a ride into town. I haven't been back since. A few weeks later, I got a call from the owner of the cabin, the real one. She'd gotten my number from the woman at the farm. She was confused, said she hadn't listed the place since summer. I sent her the confirmation email, the booking site. It was gone. Link broken. No trace of the page. No trace of the listing. No company records. She went to check the cabin herself a few days later. She said the place was a mess. Damp towels in the windows, mugs left out, muddy footprints across the floor. She also said something else, that there were scratches on the back wall. Deep ones, like fingernails or a knife. She asked if I'd seen anyone while I was there. I told her the truth. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she told me something I still think about sometimes. There was a woman who used to live near there, a recluse, No one really knew her, but she used to walk the woods. She wore an old beige coat, long hair, thin face. People said she was odd, but quiet. She disappeared sometime around 2004. Police never found her. She wasn't from the area. No family, no records. She just vanished. But the part that stuck with me, the part that really kept me awake for nights afterward, was what the owner said last. That cabin didn't have a loft. Not anymore. It had been sealed years ago. Floorboards nailed shut. No ladder, no access. Nothing. I remembered the mat I saw up there. The cobwebs. The empty space. I remembered how I never actually looked up while I slept. I haven't gone into the woods since. Not alone. Not ever. I was 27 when I decided to spend the summer alone in my uncle's old cabin in northern Arkansas. It was 2016, and I had just gone through a rough patch. Left a job I hated in St. Louis, broke up with someone I shouldn't have dated for that long, and needed space from the endless noise of city life. I thought time in the country would clear my head. I wasn't looking for peace exactly, just quiet, a reset. The cabin sat on a 100-acre piece of farmland that hadn't been worked in years. My Uncle Jack, who passed in 2011, used to raise cattle and a few hogs. But once he died, my aunt sold the animals and left the place abandoned. The house wasn't much. Really, wooden frame, tin roof, no insulation, and one generator-powered light that buzzed faintly when it worked. There was a well pump out back, a composting toilet my uncle built himself, and an old propane stove that sometimes hissed even when it wasn't on. Most of the furniture was handmade, rough and heavy and splintered at the edges, and the windows were so dirty they might as well have been walls. Still, I liked it. There was no reception, no internet, and the nearest neighbor was about 6 miles down a gravel road. The first night I couldn't sleep, not because I was scared, just because it was so damn quiet. That kind of silence rings in your ears if you're not used to it. I lay there in that creaky twin bed, watching the ceiling, hearing nothing but my own heartbeat, a cricket outside the window, and the occasional groan of the old wood shifting in the wind. I fell asleep eventually and woke up to the sound of a wild turkey picking around just outside the porch. For the first 2 weeks, everything went the way I'd hoped. I read books from a moldy cardboard box I found in the closet, hiked down to the dried-up creek bed every morning, took naps in the heat of the afternoon, and cooked over a fire pit out front when the stove gave me trouble. I patched up a hole in the screen door and swept out most of the rat droppings from the kitchen. There was something satisfying about fixing up that place, even though I wasn't staying long. I knew I'd have to leave once the weather turned, or once I ran out of propane. But for a while, it felt good to be cut off from everything. Then small things started to bother me. The first time, I didn't even think much of it. I found one of my boots, my good leather work boots, halfway across the yard one morning. I'd left them on the porch overnight, but now one was in the grass, soaked in dew, the laces dragged out like someone had tried them on. I figured maybe a raccoon or a possum had been nosing around. But then 2 days later, the other one was gone entirely. I never found it. I started bringing things inside after that. Kept the porch swept, made sure nothing was left out, even locked the door at night, though I knew that lock wouldn't keep much out if someone really wanted in. Still, the idea of someone out there didn't feel real yet. I just blamed animals or wind, or the kind of forgetfulness that comes from being alone too long. You lose your sharpness when no one else is around. But then I started noticing other things. I had a stack of old notebooks I was writing in, mostly just thoughts, sketches, sometimes rough maps of the property. One morning, I found one of the notebooks moved across the room. It was sitting on top of the fridge, open to a page I hadn't written in. My handwriting was the same, but the words weren't mine, just scribbles and odd shapes. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I'd done it while half asleep, Or maybe I was just getting bored and weird, but it made me uneasy. I burned that notebook in the fire pit that night. Not long after that, I stopped sleeping through the night. I'd wake up at 3 o'clock or 4 a.m., heart pounding for no reason. Sometimes I'd think I heard footsteps outside, crunching in the gravel or pacing across the wooden porch. But when I checked, nothing was there. Still, I started keeping a small hatchet by the bed. I told myself it was just in case of a wild animal. But deep down, I knew I was preparing for something else. By mid-July, I started keeping track of things. A strange scrape on the doorframe, a tuft of hair on the back steps, muddy prints along the path behind the house. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots, human boots. I took a photo of one with my old phone even though I had no way to upload it. I just needed some kind of proof that I wasn't imagining it. I started sleeping less and less. Ate only canned food because I didn't want to go outside to the pump after dark. Every sound put me on edge. I knew someone was out there. I started to think maybe they'd been there longer than I realized, watching me before I ever noticed. And then one morning I found the deer. It was hanging from the tree about 20 yards behind the cabin. Not gutted properly, not strung up the way hunters do. Its body was twisted like it had been pulled into place by force. Its eyes were gone. Its hooves were snapped backwards. The rope was frayed like it had been reused too many times. I stood there looking at it for 10 minutes before I even moved. My brain wouldn't process it. I didn't take a picture. I didn't touch it. I just walked back inside, locked the door, and sat on the floor for hours. After that, everything escalated. I heard voices, not ghost voices or anything like that, real human voices in the woods. Far off, muffled, like people talking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were real. Every night after that, I saw flickers of light through the trees, flashlights or lanterns, never close enough to make out a face, but always moving, always circling. I thought about leaving, packed my bag twice, but I couldn't bring myself to go out there in the dark. I kept thinking if I just stayed inside, they'd leave me alone. Maybe it was squatters or drug people or just some freak who liked scaring folks. Maybe they thought I'd leave on my own, but I didn't. On the last night, I woke up to the sound of someone trying the doorknob. It was subtle at first, a faint rattle. Then it stopped. Then came again. Then harder. It wasn't frantic. It was slow, testing, measuring. I sat up in bed with the hatchet in my hand, sweat rolling down my neck. The cabin was pitch black. I hadn't lit the generator light in days. I didn't move, just waited. Then came the sound of the porch boards groaning under weight, a shift of pressure against the wall, the scratching of something metal along the siding. I held my breath and counted the seconds. 5, 10. Then silence again. I stayed like that until morning. When the sun came up, I found the side of the cabin covered in symbols, carved deep into the wood. Some looked like crude stick figures. Some were just lines crossed over and over again. And one was a set of numbers. I didn't recognize them at first, but later I realized it was the GPS coordinates of the cabin. Whoever was out there wanted me to know I wasn't just stumbled upon. They had found me on purpose. I left that day, left the propane tanks, the clothes, the books, the generator, left everything. I packed a single bag and walked 6 miles to the highway. Didn't wait, didn't call, just stuck my thumb out until a truck pulled over. I never told anyone the full story. I said there was a trespasser, maybe some poachers. Said I got nervous and bailed. I never went back. 2 years later, in 2018, a hunter found something buried about half a mile from the cabin. A backpack, a metal box, and a journal. Not mine. Belonged to a man named Curtis Day. Last known address was somewhere in Oklahoma. He had disappeared in 2009 while hiking through the Ozarks. Inside the journal were pages of frantic writing, maps of the woods, and lists of names, none of which I recognized. The last entry said only this: "They live here." No one ever figured out who they were. Police ruled it out as mental illness, a survivalist who cracked. But I don't think so. I think he found the same thing I did, and maybe he didn't leave in time. I think about that sometimes, late at night when the world gets too quiet. When I forget why I avoid cabins, why I check the locks twice, why I keep a flashlight and a knife by the bed. It all comes back. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is they were real. They were watching, and they knew exactly where I was. And that's enough.